I found out my father's heart had stopped beating through a black and white Instagram story. There was no frantic, late-night phone call from the hospital, no solemn knock on my apartment door by a sympathetic doctor, and certainly no tearful message from his wife. Instead, I was sitting on my battered thrift store sofa on a Tuesday evening, scrolling mindlessly through my feed, when the algorithm delivered the blow. It was posted by Trent, my 24-year-old stepbrother, whose previous story had been a vanity shot of a $5,000 bottle of champagne at a rooftop club. Now, it was a meticulously staged, highly filtered photograph of his manicured hand resting gently on my father's hospital bed railing. The caption, written in a sleek designer font, read, "Lost a real one today. The king is gone. R.I.P. to the man who gave me the world. Legacy # grief # empire." My breath caught in my throat like swallowed glass. I stared at the screen until my phone went dark, my own pale reflection staring back at me in the cracked glass. He was dead. My father, the untouchable titan of industry, was dead. And Alina, the woman who had spent the last 12 years systematically erasing me from his life, couldn't even afford me the basic human dignity of a phone call. She had allowed her parasite of a son to turn the sudden death of my father into monetizable social media content before his body was even cold. The shock didn't register as tears. It manifested as a deep, echoing ringing in my ears, drowning out the ambient noise of the city traffic humming outside my apartment window. My father, Richard Vance, was a man composed entirely of sharp angles, ironclad contracts, and quiet, imposing wealth. He had built a sprawling commercial real estate and logistics empire from the ground up. He was a man who commanded boardrooms with a single, icy stare, a man who orchestrated multi-million-dollar acquisitions before his morning coffee. Yet, he possessed a fatal flaw that entirely contradicted his boardroom ruthlessness. In his personal life, he was a coward. He abhorred emotional conflict. He bought his peace, paying whatever exorbitant price was required to avoid an argument, a tear, or a difficult conversation. And 12 years ago, Alina had figured out his exact price. My mother had passed away when I was 10. For a few years, it was just my father and me rattling around our massive, warm, slightly cluttered estate in the hills. He was distant, throwing himself into 80-hour work weeks to outrun his grief, but he was there. There were quiet Sunday mornings over burnt toast, awkward but well-meaning attempts to braid my hair, and a silent, mutual understanding of our shared loss. Then, he met Alina at a charity gala. Alina was a masterclass in predatory elegance. She possessed the kind of manufactured, terrifyingly pristine beauty that cost a small fortune to maintain. She introduced herself as an independent art consultant, though I would later learn her only real talent was identifying vulnerable, unimaginably wealthy widowers and embedding herself in their lives like a well-dressed tick. When my father first brought her home to the estate, she floated through our front doors enveloped in a suffocating cloud of Chanel, her eyes darting around the grand foyer not with admiration, but with the cold, calculating appraisal of a real estate developer surveying a teardown. Trapped in her orbit were her two sons from a previous, highly redacted marriage, Trent and Chase, then 12 and 13 years old. From the moment they crossed our threshold, the toxic normal was established. Alina's invasion wasn't a sudden, violent coup. It was a slow, agonizing campaign of psychological warfare and territorial expansion, executed with terrifying patience. The erasure of my mother, and by extension, me began with the house. Under the guise of freshening up the energy, Alina launched a relentless remodeling campaign. The rich, mahogany bookshelves my mother had curated were ripped out and replaced with sterile, floating glass shelves holding unread, color-coordinated art books. My mother's antique grand piano, the instrument I had spent years learning to play, quietly disappeared one weekend while I was at a sleepover, replaced by a grotesque, jagged metal sculpture that Alina claimed was an investment piece. Whenever I dared to ask where my mother's things had gone, Alina would place a cool, manicured hand on my shoulder, flash a sympathetic, razor-thin smile, and say, "Oh, sweetie, your father and I just felt the house was so heavy with the past. We're looking toward the future now, you understand, don't you?" If I pushed back, if I cried or complained to my father, Eleanor would deploy her ultimate weapon, tears of victimization. She would weep quietly in my father's study, lamenting how hard she was trying to be a mother to a girl who hated her, how she just wanted us to be a real family. My father, terrified of the emotional turbulence, would immediately capitulate. He would write her a check for a trip to Milan to soothe her nerves, and then he would awkwardly ask me to be more accommodating. "She's trying, Claire," he would sigh, rubbing his temples. "Just let her have the house, it's only things." But it wasn't just things, it was my space. By the time I was 16, I had been systematically pushed to the absolute periphery of the family. My large, sunlit bedroom near my father's master suite was requisitioned because Chase needed the natural light for his sprawling, chaotic sneaker collection and his newly discovered, incredibly loud passion for DJing. I was relocated to a small, drafty guest room in the far east wing of the house, practically in a different zip code from my father. While I was marginalized, Trent and Chase were elevated to the status of minor deities. My father funded their lives with a blank check, purchasing their affection and Eleanor's silence. They were the epitome of arrogant, unearned luxury. Chase, the older of the two, fancied himself a serial entrepreneur. In reality, he was a chronic liability who couldn't spell business plan. Over the years, my father bankrolled a string of humiliatingly stupid ventures for him. A luxury organic dog water brand that resulted in a massive warehouse of rotting inventory. A cryptocurrency token that was essentially a thinly veiled Ponzi scheme, requiring my father's high-powered lawyers to settle out of court to keep Chase out of federal prison. And a premium cigar lounge that burned down under highly suspicious circumstances 6 weeks after opening. Every failure was met not with discipline, but with Eleanor's soothing excuses about Chase being a visionary who was simply ahead of his time, followed by another massive wire transfer from my father to clear the debts. Trent, on the other hand, didn't even pretend to work. He was a professional parasite, leaning entirely into the burgeoning influencer lifestyle. He spent his days renting yachts in Dubai on my father's black card, buying custom-wrapped supercars, and posting profound, pseudo-philosophical quotes over pictures of his Rolexes. He referred to my father not as a parent, but as the bank or the governor, treating him with a smarmy, condescending familiarity that made my skin crawl. I survived the toxic normal by removing myself from the blast radius. The day I turned 18, I packed my meager belongings into a used Honda Civic I bought with money saved from a high school tutoring job, and I left. I didn't ask for a trust fund, and none was offered. I took out crippling student loans, ground my way through a degree in data analytics, and landed a solid, unspectacular job at a logistics firm, ironically, a minor competitor to one of my father's subsidiaries. I lived in a fourth-floor walk-up with faulty heating, paid my own bills, and existed entirely outside the insulated, gilded bubble of the Vance estate. My relationship with my father dwindled to scheduled, superficial lunches once a quarter. His administrative assistant, a stern woman named Beatrice, would email me a calendar invite. We would meet at an aggressively exclusive, hushed country club. He would look older every time I saw him, the skin around his eyes bruised with exhaustion, his shoulders bowed under the weight of an empire and a parasitic family. We would talk politely about the bond markets, about my job, about the weather. But without fail, 45 minutes into the lunch, his phone would ring. It was always Eleanor. There was always a manufactured crisis. The pool contractor was threatening to walk off the job, Trent had dented the Bentley, and the police were being unreasonable. Chase needed a signature for a new commercial lease immediately. My father would look at me with a mixture of profound weariness and deep, unspoken apology. He would pay the bill, press a crisp $100 bill into the palm of the valet, and drive back into his golden cage. He justified my exile to himself by weaponizing my independence. "You're strong, Claire," he told me during one of our final lunches, his eyes refusing to meet mine. "You have a good head on your shoulders. You've built a life. Trent and Chase, they need my help. They're sensitive boys, they drown out there without me." It was the most devastating compliment a father could give. He was acknowledging that I was the only capable child he had, and using that as the exact justification to abandon me. He had traded me away for the illusion of peace, feeding his wealth into the bottomless, screaming maw of Eleanor and her sons, while I sat across from him, sipping tap water, quietly mourning a man who was still breathing. Until tonight. Sitting on my couch, the blue light of the dead phone screen casting long shadows across my living room, the paralysis finally broke. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me. I stood up, my joints popping in the quiet apartment. I didn't bother changing out of my sweatpants and oversized college hoodie. I grabbed my keys, walked out the door, and drove. The drive to the estate took 40 minutes. The skies over the city were clear, but the air was unseasonably hot and thick, pressing down on the windshield like a wet wool blanket. I drove up the winding, canyon roads, the modest streetlights giving way to total darkness, illuminated only by my headlights sweeping across the sprawling, gated entrances of the ultra-wealthy. My mind was a terrifyingly blank space. There was no grief yet. There was only a singular, burning directive. I needed to see him. I needed to know the truth. I needed to stand in the house I grew up in and force Eleanor to look me in the eye and explain why a hashtag reached me before she did. I pulled my dented Civic up to the colossal wrought iron gates of the Vance compound. The stone pillars on either side were bathed in soft, dramatic uplighting. I rolled down my window, the humid night air rushing in, and punched my personal access code into the glowing security keypad. Beep beep beep, red light, access denied. I frowned, thinking I had miskeyed it in my haste. I typed it again, slower. My birth date and my mother's birth year. The code that had been mine since I was 12 years old. Beep beep beep, red light. A slow, creeping dread began to coil in my stomach. I pressed the silver call button beneath the keypad. It rang 3 times before a voice crackled through the speaker. It wasn't the familiar, friendly voice of Hector, the older gentleman who had worked security for my father for a decade. It was a sharp, clinical, unfamiliar voice. Vance Residence Security, state your business. This is Claire Vance, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Open the gate. There was a long pause. I could hear the faint sound of typing. I'm sorry, ma'am. You're not on the authorized entry list for tonight. We are not receiving visitors. I am not a visitor, I snapped, my fingers gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I am Richard Vance's daughter. My father lives here. I'm aware of the situation, Miss Vance, the guard replied, his tone devoid of any empathy. My condolences. However, Mrs. Vance gave strict, explicit instructions regarding perimeter control this evening. I cannot open the gate without her direct authorization. Then get her on the phone, I demanded, the volume of my voice rising, echoing slightly in the quiet canyon. Right now. Another pause, longer this time. I sat in my car, the engine idling roughly, staring at the imposing iron bars that separated me from my own history. Finally, the intercom clicked again, but it wasn't the guard. Claire, darling. Eleanor's voice poured out of the tinny speaker, smooth as poisoned honey. There was no tremor of grief, no exhaustion, no sorrow. She sounded perfectly composed, lightly annoyed, as if I were a persistent telemarketer interrupting her evening tea. Eleanor, open the gate, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Oh, sweetie, it is incredibly late, she sighed into the microphone. And it has been an absolutely devastating, exhausting day. The boys and I are simply inconsolable. We are grieving as a family. The house is a mess of doctors and lawyers, and it's just not a good time. He was my father, Eleanor. Open the goddamn gate. Language, Claire, she chided gently, a sickeningly maternal tone lacing her words. Your father suffered a massive cardiac event in his office this afternoon. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. He was gone before they even reached the hospital. There is nothing for you to see here. The coroner has already taken him. I'm afraid your rushing over here is terribly dramatic and entirely unhelpful. You didn't call me, I stated, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. Trent posted it on Instagram. Trent is processing his trauma in his own way, Eleanor said smoothly, immediately defending her golden child. He lost his hero today. We all did. I was going to call you in the morning, Claire, once things were civilized. Arthur would not want a hysterical scene on his driveway at midnight. Arthur, she always called him Arthur. It was a subtle domination, stripping him of the title of Dad. Let me in, I demanded one last time, though I knew it was futile. The heavy iron gates looked monolithic, immovable. "Go home, Claire." Eleanor's voice hardened, dropping the faux sweetness for a brief, revealing second. The steel beneath the silk. "I have instructed the new security team. Yes, we've had to upgrade. So many vultures circle when a great man dies, that you are not to be permitted on the grounds without an appointment. The locks on the main house have already been changed. We will see you at the funeral, if you can manage to find something appropriate to wear." The intercom clicked dead. A flat, continuous static replaced her voice. I sat there for 5 full minutes, the engine humming, the red light of the keypad glaring at me in the dark. She had done it. Within hours of his heart stopping, before his obituary was even drafted, she had completely annexed the kingdom. She had locked me out, physically and legally, cementing my status as an outsider. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it washed over me, crystallizing my grief into something vastly different. Something cold, sharp, and infinitely patient. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply put the car in reverse, backed out of the sprawling driveway, and drove down the mountain. The next 5 days were a surreal, nightmarish blur of weaponized wealth and social theater. The funeral was not a mourning. It was a high society gala disguised as a memorial service. Eleanor spared absolutely no expense, utilizing the event to cement her status as the newly crowned queen of the Vance Empire. It was held at the largest, most ostentatious cathedral in the city. The guest list was a who's who of local politicians, rival real estate developers, and socialites, most of whom my father had actively despised. I arrived alone. I wore a simple, tailored black dress I had bought off the rack at a department store. The moment I walked into the cavernous, echoing cathedral, I felt the immediate, suffocating weight of my isolation. The ushers, men I didn't recognize, likely hired through an elite event planning agency, intercepted me at the door. When I gave my name, they checked their embossed clipboards and escorted me not to the front row reserved for immediate family, but to the fourth row, on the far left aisle, sandwiched between a group of mid-level logistics managers who looked terrified to be there. I sat in the pew and watched the grotesque pantomime unfold. The front row was an impenetrable wall of Eleanor and her sons. Eleanor was draped in a custom-designed, dramatically sweeping black veil and a couture morning suit that probably cost more than my annual salary. She sat perfectly straight, occasionally dabbing her dry eyes with a monogrammed lace handkerchief whenever a photographer from the society pages dared to creep too close. Flanking her were Trent and Chase. They looked less like grieving stepsons and more like mafia underbosses arriving at a summit. They were both wearing bespoke, razor-sharp Tom Ford suits, their wrists heavy with platinum watches. Throughout the solemn service, while the hired choir sang soaring, melancholic hymns, I watched them whisper to each other. I watched Trent subtly check his phone, likely monitoring the engagement metrics on his morning posts. I watched Chase subtly nod and wink at a prominent venture capitalist sitting across the aisle. They weren't grieving, they were networking. They were smelling the blood in the water, practically vibrating with the anticipation of the inheritance that was about to rain down upon them. At the front of the cathedral rested the casket. It was closed. Solid mahogany, gleaming with brass accents, draped in an obnoxious, massive blanket of white orchids. I stared at the wood, trying to feel a connection, trying to summon the image of my father teaching me how to ride a bike, or the rare moments he smiled a genuine, unguarded smile. But all I could see was the vast, impenetrable distance he had allowed to grow between us. He was dead, and he had died a stranger to me, surrounded by people who viewed him as nothing more than a highly lucrative ATM. When the service concluded, the massive crowd spilled out onto the cathedral steps into the glaring afternoon sun. I lingered near the grand wooden doors, hoping for a moment of quiet, a chance to perhaps walk near the casket as it was loaded into the hearse. Before I could, I was intercepted. Eleanor glided through the crowd of well-wishers, parting them like the Red Sea. She moved with an undeniable, terrifying power. She approached me, stopping just out of arm's reach. Up close, beneath the sheer black netting of her veil, her eyes were bright, alert, and triumphant. She didn't look like a widow. She looked like a CEO who had just successfully executed a hostile takeover. "Claire," she said, her voice pitched perfectly to project warmth to the onlookers while remaining entirely frigid to me. "I'm so glad you could make it. I know how difficult it is for you to take time off from your little job." "It's a funeral, Eleanor. I didn't have to check my PTO balance," I replied flatly, refusing to break eye contact. Her smile tightened just a fraction. "Of course. Well, it was a beautiful send-off. Your father would have been so proud of the turnout. The mayor even sent his regards." She adjusted a diamond brooch on her lapel, a piece I recognized as belonging to my grandmother. "I want to be clear about the coming days, Claire. The estate is currently in a state of deep transition. The boys and I require privacy to heal. The security protocols will remain in place." "I have no interest in visiting your fortress," I said. "Good. That makes things simple," she murmured, stepping closer, dropping the volume so only I could hear. The scent of her expensive perfume was overwhelming, cloying in the heat. "Your father was a complicated man, Claire. He left behind a very complex web of assets. There are loose ends. We are dealing with his attorneys to streamline the process." She reached into her designer handbag and produced a sleek, thick cream-colored envelope, embossed with the logo of my father's high-powered legal firm. She extended it toward me, holding it between two fingers like it was contaminated. "We will be holding the formal reading of the will this coming Tuesday at 10 in the morning. At Sterling and Vance," she said, naming the law firm. "I expect you to be punctual. We are going to handle this quickly and efficiently, so my boys and I can finally close this chapter and move forward." I took the envelope, it felt unnaturally heavy. "I'll be there," I said. Eleanor gave me one last, sweeping look of utter dismissal, from my scuffed black heels to my unstyled hair. "I'm sure you will, darling. Just remember, Arthur was a generous man, but he was also a realist. Don't expect miracles." With that, she turned on her heel and glided toward the waiting fleet of Blacktown cars, her sons falling into step behind her like obedient, well-dressed attack dogs. I stood alone on the steps of the cathedral, the hot wind rustling the thick envelope in my hand. The absolute certainty in Eleanor's voice, the smug, unrestrained arrogance of the stepbrothers, and the locked gates of my childhood home all pointed to one undeniable fact. They had orchestrated everything. They had spent 12 years making sure I was written out of the narrative, and Tuesday was meant to be the final, crushing blow. I looked down at the envelope, my thumb tracing the embossed lettering of the law firm. The grief finally gave way, fully and completely, to a cold, crystalline fury. I didn't know what my father had left behind, but as I watched Eleanor's town car disappear into the city traffic, I knew one thing for certain. I was walking into a slaughter, and they expected me to just lay down and bleed. The offices of Sterling and Vance occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming, monolithic glass skyscraper in the city's financial district. It was a building designed to intimidate, a towering monument to exorbitant hourly billing rates and the quiet, ruthless shifting of capital. On Tuesday morning, precisely at 9:45, I stepped out of the high-speed elevator and into the hushed, sterile reception area. The air up here felt entirely different from the street level. It was aggressively climate-controlled, thick with the scent of fresh orchids and expensive lemon-scented wood polish. The receptionist, a young woman with a perfectly symmetrical face and an immaculate silk blouse, barely looked up from her dual monitors when I approached her mahogany desk. "Claire Vance," I said, my voice sounding unnecessarily loud in the cavernous, quiet space. "I'm here for the reading at 10. She tapped a manicured fingernail against her mouse, her eyes scanning a digital calendar. "Ah, yes, Miss Vance. Mr. Sterling is expecting the family in conference room A right down the hall. Last heavy oak door on your left." I didn't bother correcting her assumption that we were a family. I simply nodded, bypassed the array of sleek leather waiting chairs, and walked down the long, carpeted corridor. The walls were lined with framed, abstract art that meant nothing, chosen entirely to convey an aura of sophisticated neutrality. My heart was a slow, steady drumbeat against my ribs. I had spent the last 5 days mentally preparing myself for this exact hour. I had built a fortress around my emotions, laying the bricks with every memory of Eleanor's subtle cruelties and my father's passive abandonments. I knew I was about to be officially, legally erased. I just needed to survive the surgical precision of it without giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. I reached the heavy oak door and pushed it open. Conference Room A was vast, dominated by a 20-foot slab of polished granite that served as a table. The far wall was entirely floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a sweeping, godlike view of the sprawling city below. But I barely noticed the view. My eyes immediately locked onto the three people already seated at the table. They had arranged themselves strategically, occupying the center of the long side of the table facing the door, forcing anyone who entered to face them like a tribunal. Eleanor sat in the middle, flanked by Trent on her right and Chase on her left. The visual was nauseating. Eleanor was dressed in a charcoal gray designer suit that screamed subdued, unassailable wealth. Her posture was rigidly perfect, a leather-bound notepad and a gold Montblanc pen resting squarely in front of her. Trent was slouched in his ergonomic leather chair, aggressively chewing a piece of gum. He was wearing a black designer t-shirt under a tailored blazer, his phone resting face up on the table so he could monitor incoming notifications. Chase was aggressively tapping his foot, his eyes darting around the room with the nervous, unearned energy of a man who firmly believed he was the smartest person in the building. Standing at the head of the table was Arthur Sterling, a man who looked exactly like a high-powered estate attorney should. Late 60s, silver hair perfectly coiffed, wearing a suit that cost more than my car, with a face permanently etched with the practiced, neutral expression of a man who had seen generations of wealthy families tear each other apart over silver spoons. The conversation in the room abruptly died the second I crossed the threshold. "Ah, Claire," Mr. Sterling said, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was a rich, rumbling baritone, punctual as always. "Please take a seat." He gestured to a chair on the opposite side of the table, directly across from Eleanor. I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down, placing my modest handbag on the floor next to my scuffed pumps. I folded my hands on the cold granite. Eleanor didn't say a word. She simply offered me a tight, closed-mouth smile, a masterclass in polite condescension, before turning her attention back to Mr. Sterling. Trent didn't even look up from his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen. Chase snorted softly, a sound of pure dismissal, and leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers behind his head. "Now that we are all present," Mr. Sterling began, taking his seat at the head of the table and opening a remarkably thick, leather-bound folder, "we can commence with the formal reading of the last will and testament of Richard Thomas Vance. Before I begin, I must state for the record that I am acting as the executor of this estate, as appointed by Richard prior to his passing. The document before me was finalized and heavily revised 3 months ago." A microscopic tremor ran through my jaw. 3 months ago. He had updated it recently. Whatever was about to happen wasn't some outdated oversight, it was a fresh, deliberate choice. "I will spare you the standard boilerplate legalese where possible," Sterling continued, adjusting his tortoiseshell reading glasses. "The estate of Richard Vance is, as you are all acutely aware, vastly complex, comprising liquid assets, real estate holdings, offshore investment portfolios, and majority controlling shares in Vance Logistics and its subsidiaries." He cleared his throat, turned a crisp, thick page, and the dismemberment of my father's empire began. Article 4, Real Property. "To my wife, Eleanor Vance, I leave the primary residence located in the Canyon Estates, in fee simple absolute, along with all furnishings, art, and personal property contained therein. I also leave the vacation properties located in Aspen, Colorado, and Maui, Hawaii, to Eleanor Vance, free and clear of any encumbrances." Eleanor nodded solemnly, jotting a single, graceful note on her pad with her gold pen. She didn't look surprised. This was the baseline expectation. Article 5, Corporate Holdings and Liquid Assets, Sterling droned on, his voice betraying no emotion. "The majority controlling voting shares of Vance Logistics, amounting to 51% of the total company stock, are hereby transferred to a newly established irrevocable trust, the Eleanor Vance Management Trust, with Eleanor Vance named as the sole trustee and primary beneficiary. Furthermore, all primary investment portfolios, high-yield savings accounts, and domestic bonds are to be transferred directly to Eleanor Vance." Chase leaned forward, the nervous tapping of his foot ceasing. Trent finally put his phone face down. Article 6, Provisions for Stepsons, Sterling read, turning another page. To my stepsons, Trenton and Chase, whom I have raised and loved as my own blood. The words hit me like a physical strike to the sternum. As my own blood. My fingernails dug into the palms of my hands under the table. I established 2 independent generation-skipping trust funds, each capitalized with an initial principal of $5 million to be disbursed in monthly dividends. Furthermore, the titles to the current vehicles they operate, the 2024 Mercedes G-Wagon and the 2025 Aston Martin DB12, are transferred to them entirely. Trent let out a low, breathy whistle, a smirk breaking across his handsome, punchable face. Under the table, out of Sterling's line of sight, Chase extended a fist and Trent bumped it. It was a silent, grotesque celebration of a windfall built on the corpse of the man they had relentlessly leached off of. Eleanor shot them a sharp, warning glance, not out of respect for my father, but to maintain the optics of solemn grief in front of the lawyer. The reading continued for another grueling 20 minutes. Sterling meticulously listed smaller assets, charitable donations, and minor corporate restructurings. With every sentence, Eleanor's absolute, total victory was compounded. She hadn't just secured her future. She had swallowed the entirety of my father's legacy whole. There was nothing left. The multi-million-dollar empire had been carved up and served on silver platters to the 3 people who had actively destroyed his peace of mind. Finally, Sterling turned the last heavy page. The silence in the room shifted, growing suddenly sharp and intensely focused. I could feel the collective weight of 3 pairs of eyes burning into me. Eleanor stopped writing. Trent leaned forward, a feral anticipation in his eyes. Chase was practically vibrating. They had been waiting for this exact moment. Article 7, Provisions for Biological Offspring, Sterling read, his booming voice dropping half an octave. He looked up from the document, meeting my gaze over the rims of his glasses. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw a flicker of genuine pity in his eyes. It was worse than hatred. To my biological daughter, Claire Vance, Sterling read, his pace slowing deliberately. I leave the sum total of $1, ensuring that she cannot contest this will on the grounds of being forgotten. In addition, I leave her the contents of storage unit number 412, located at Safe and Sound Storage on 4th and Industrial. It is my strict, final wish that Claire, and only Claire, take possession of whatever is left inside. The silence that followed was absolute. I sat frozen, my face a carefully constructed mask of stone. $1, and a storage unit in the industrial district. It wasn't an oversight. It was a calculated, devastating insult, legally codified to echo through the rest of my life. Sterling reached into a drawer beneath the granite table and produced a small, slightly discolored manila envelope. He slid it across the vast expanse of polished stone. The envelope stopped perfectly in front of me. I stared at it. It looked pathetic resting on the luxurious table. Slowly, I reached out and picked it up. It felt impossibly light. I broke the brittle seal with my thumb and tipped the contents into my palm. A single, incredibly heavy rusted brass key fell out, along with a small square of cheap, lined notebook paper. On the paper, written in my father's unmistakable, sharp handwriting, was the address of the storage facility and the unit number. That was it. No letter of explanation, no secret check, just a piece of jagged, oxidating metal and an address in the worst part of the city. A sharp, brittle laugh shattered the silence. It was Eleanor. She wasn't bothering to hide her amusement anymore. The pretense of the grieving widow was entirely gone, replaced by the victorious, gloating monarch. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes tracing my reaction, hungry for a tear, a scream, a breakdown. "Well," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy that barely concealed her venom. "I suppose Arthur always was sentimental about his old junk. He never could bring himself to throw out those moldy college textbooks or his awful, rusted golf clubs. It's fitting he wanted you to have them, Claire. A little piece of his past." "Brutal," Trent whispered, though loud enough for the entire room to hear. He picked his phone back up, his thumbs flying. "Probably updating his followers about his new trust fund. I'm afraid I have some bad news, though." Eleanor continued, leaning forward, resting her elbows on the granite, her eyes locking onto mine with predatory intensity. The estate is not going to cover the monthly rental fee for that unit going forward. I'm certainly not going to authorize payments for a locker full of garbage. You have until the end of the month to clear it out, or the facility will auction it off. Make sure you bring a truck, sweetie, and maybe a tetanus shot. She smiled. It was a terrifying, perfect smile. It was the smile of a woman who had spent a decade playing a long, agonizing game of chess and had just proudly slammed her queen down for the checkmate. She had taken his houses, his money, his company, and his legacy. And she had ensured that his only biological child was handed literal garbage in front of an audience. I looked down at the rusty key resting against my pale skin. My pulse was roaring in my ears, a deafening cascade of rage and profound, paralyzing humiliation. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the granite table. I wanted to reach across the divide and wipe that smug, patrician smile off her perfectly contoured face. But I didn't. If I broke, she won twice. The toxic normal had taught me one critical survival skill: never, ever bleed in front of the sharks. I slowly curled my fingers, enclosing the cold, rough metal of the key in my fist. I picked up the piece of paper, slid it back into the manila envelope, and placed it calmly into my handbag. I stood up, my movements precise and deliberate. I pushed my heavy leather chair neatly back under the table. I looked at Mr. Sterling. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Sterling. Is my presence required for anything else?" Sterling looked mildly taken aback by my composure. "No, Miss Vance, that concludes your portion of the reading. You are free to go. A copy of the relevant documents will be mailed to your address on file." I didn't look at Eleanor. I didn't look at Trent or Chase. I turned my back on the millions of dollars, the sprawling empire, and the people who had stolen my father, and I walked out of the conference room. I kept my spine violently straight, my footsteps echoing evenly down the long, carpeted hallway. I didn't let out the breath I was holding until the elevator doors slid shut, sealing me inside the descending metal box, plunging me back down to the street level, utterly and completely disinherited. 45 minutes later, the sterile, lemon-scented air of the financial district was a distant memory. I drove my dented Civic into the deep industrial sector of the city, a sprawling wasteland of crumbling brick warehouses, chain-link fences topped with razor wire, and the relentless, grinding noise of freight trains. The heat of the midday sun baked the cracked asphalt, causing the air to shimmer with a hazy mirage. The smell of exhaust, stale beer, and sun-baked garbage permeated the interior of my car. I pulled up to the address written on my father's note: Safe and Sound Storage. The name was a tragic irony. The facility was a sprawling, single-story labyrinth of faded orange roll-up doors bordered by a sagging perimeter fence. The main office was a cramped, dirty trailer resting on cinder blocks. The automated gate was permanently stuck open, the motor mechanism visibly rusted through. I parked in a patch of dirt and walked into the office. The attendant behind the reinforced plexiglass was a teenager with a fresh neck tattoo, deeply engrossed in a video game on his phone. He didn't look up when I slid the rusty key and the slip of paper under the glass slot. "Unit 412, I said flatly. He glanced at the paper, then at me, popping a bubble of pink gum. "Row G all the way in the back, near the train tracks. Watch out for the stray dogs. And hey, rent is due on the 1st. If it ain't paid by Friday, I'm putting a master lock on it." "Understood," I said. I drove my car slowly down the narrow, pothole-riddled avenues of the facility. Row A, Row B, Row C. The deeper I went, the worse the condition of the units became. Several doors were dented inward, others were tagged with crude, overlapping graffiti. The relentless summer sun beat down on the corrugated metal roofs, turning the entire complex into a sprawling, low-rent oven. I finally reached Row G, the very last unit, pressed right up against the rusted chain-link fence that separated the facility from an active rail yard, bore the faded, peeling numbers 4 to 1 to 2. I put my car in park and stepped out into the sweltering heat. The air tasted like iron and dust. I walked up to the orange metal door. The latch mechanism was heavily oxidized, caked in years of grime. I took a deep breath, inserted the heavy brass key into the padlock, and turned. It resisted for a second, the internal tumblers grinding against each other, before giving way with a harsh, metallic clack. I pulled the padlock free, grabbed the greasy handle of the roll-up door, and heaved upward. The door screamed in protest, the rusted tracks shrieking as the metal curtain rolled into the ceiling. A wave of stagnant, suffocating heat rolled out of the dark interior, carrying the unmistakable, nauseating scent of mildew, rotting cardboard, and ancient dust. I stood in the glaring sunlight, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom of the 10 by 10 concrete box. Eleanor had been right. It was absolute, unadulterated garbage. The unit was packed almost to the ceiling with chaotic, moldering ruin. In the front were dozens of water-damaged cardboard boxes, their bottoms blown out, spilling yellowed, meaningless paperwork and old tax returns from the 1990s onto the oil-stained concrete floor. Behind the boxes lay a tangled graveyard of broken furniture, a three-legged dining chair, a stained, horribly floral mattress that looked like it had been salvaged from a dumpster, and a rusted, bent set of golf clubs spilling out of a rotted canvas bag. It was a monument to hoarding, a physical manifestation of a man who couldn't let go of the past but didn't care enough to preserve it properly. I leaned against the metal doorframe, the fight suddenly draining out of me. The adrenaline that had carried me through the law firm evaporated, leaving me hollow and impossibly tired. This was it. This was my legacy. $1 and a locker full of rotting debris. My father hadn't left me a secret message, or a sentimental keepsake, or a hidden trust. He had literally, intentionally willed me his trash, just to make a point, or worse, just because he genuinely didn't care. Tears, hot and furious, finally pricked the corners of my eyes. I swiped them away angrily, leaving a streak of grime across my cheek. Don't cry over this, I told myself fiercely. Don't you dare cry over a man who didn't fight for you. I looked at the floral mattress leaning precariously against a stack of collapsing boxes. Eleanor wanted me to clear it out by the end of the month. Fine. I would hire a junk removal service, let them haul it all to the county landfill, and I would walk away forever. I would change my name, sever the last microscopic thread to the Vance legacy, and disappear. I stepped into the suffocating heat of the unit to evaluate how big of a truck I would need to hire. I kicked a stray, moldy box out of the way, the damp cardboard tearing like wet tissue paper. I grabbed the edge of the stained mattress, intending to push it back to see how deep the pile of broken furniture went. The mattress was heavy, waterlogged and foul. I braced my boots against the concrete, gripped the rotting fabric, and shoved it hard to the left. It toppled over, taking a stack of cardboard boxes down with it in a cloud of choking, gray dust. I coughed, waving my hand in front of my face to clear the air. As the dust slowly settled, I looked at the floor where the mattress had been resting. I froze. The floor in the very back corner of the unit wasn't bare concrete. Resting on the ground, previously entirely concealed by the rotting mattress and the wall of trash, was a heavy, industrial tarp. It wasn't covered in dust. It looked relatively clean, out of place among the ruin. Frowning, I stepped over the debris, my heart giving a strange, irregular flutter. I grabbed the corner of the thick, gray tarp and yanked it back. Beneath it sat a massive, matte black steel cube. It was a commercial-grade, fireproof floor safe. It was roughly 3 feet high and 3 feet wide, bolted directly into the concrete foundation with heavy, industrial lag screws. It was modern, pristine, and completely unweathered. It looked utterly alien in the middle of the rotting junk. There was no digital keypad, no electronic interface that could be hacked or short-circuited. There was only a single, heavy-duty physical keyhole set into a recessed, reinforced steel plate. I stared at it, my mind racing, struggling to process the sudden, violent shift in reality. This wasn't junk. This wasn't an oversight. This was a deliberate, meticulously hidden fortification. My hands began to tremble. I reached into my handbag, my fingers scrambling frantically until they closed around the heavy, rusted brass key Mr. Sterling had given me. I knelt on the filthy concrete floor. The air in the unit was stifling, sweat rolling down my spine, but my blood ran ice cold. I inserted the rusted key into the pristine lock of the heavy safe. It slid in smoothly, a perfect machined fit. I took a sharp, shallow breath and turned the key to the right. Clack, thunk. The sound of the heavy internal deadbolts retracting was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It sounded like the opening of a vault, like the breaking of a dam. I grabbed the heavy steel handle and pulled. The thick door, weighing at least 100 pounds, swung open on silent, well-oiled hinges. The interior of the safe was lined with soft, black felt. It wasn't filled with stacks of $100 bills, or gold bullion, or bearer bonds. It was filled with data. On the bottom shelf sat a neatly stacked row of 6 external, solid-state hard drives. They were military-grade, shockproof, and clearly encrypted. Above them, filling the middle shelf, were over a dozen thick, leather-bound physical ledgers. They weren't store-bought accounting books. They were custom-made, heavy, and imposing. And resting perfectly centered on the top shelf, illuminated by a small, battery-powered LED strip that clicked on when the door opened, was a single, crisp white envelope. My name was written on the front in my father's sharp, precise handwriting. Claire. I reached out, my fingers shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I tore the envelope open. Inside was a single piece of heavy cardstock. The ink was dark, the handwriting rushed but deliberate, lacking the sterile perfection of a lawyer's dictation. It read, Claire. If you are reading this, I am gone, and the worst has come to pass. You are likely angry. You have every right to be. I was a coward. I bought my peace of mind with your happiness, and it is a sin I will carry into whatever comes next. 10 years ago, I discovered that my empire was bleeding. I investigated quietly. I didn't find a corporate rival or a careless executive. I found my wife. Eleanor is not who she pretends to be. She is a predator of the highest order. For a decade, she has been running a shadow corporation, forging my signatures, cooking the books of Vance Logistics, committing massive, sustained federal corporate tax evasion, and siphoning tens of millions of dollars into a complex web of offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. I should have gone to the authorities. I should have divorced her. But I was tired, Claire. I was so incredibly tired, and the scandal would have destroyed the company I spent my life building. So, I let her think she was getting away with it. I played the fool, but I documented everything. Every forged document, every illegal wire transfer, every hidden account, every falsified tax return. It is all here. The physical ledgers contain the shadow accounting. The hard drives contain the digital proof, the emails, the offshore routing numbers. The decryption key is your mother's birthday, backwards. I left her the empire and the will because she would never stop hunting for it otherwise. She thinks she has won. She thinks she has taken everything. But she left me my greatest asset. She left me you. You are the only person in this world I trust. You are the only person smart enough and resilient enough to do what I was too terrified to do. Take this, all of it, burn her kingdom to the ground. I am so sorry, my brilliant girl. Dad, I read the letter once. Then I read it again. The words blurred, my vision swimming as the magnitude of what I was holding crashed over me. Eleanor hadn't just stolen my father. She had been systematically robbing him, and the federal government, blind for a decade. She was a criminal, a massive, multi-million-dollar fraudster. And my father, in his final, desperate act of twisted redemption, had weaponized his own cowardice. He had laid a trap, using the very arrogance and greed of my stepmother against her. He knew she would insult me. He knew she would give me the junk without a second thought. I looked up from the letter, staring at the neatly stacked ledgers and the blinking red lights of the hard drives. The suffocating heat of the storage unit vanished, replaced by an electric, terrifying surge of absolute power. My father was right. Eleanor thought she had won. She was sitting in her stolen mansion right now, celebrating her untouchable victory, entirely unaware that the quiet, discarded daughter she had banished to a rusty storage unit had just been handed the keys to a nuclear arsenal. I carefully folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket. I reached into the safe and pulled out the first heavy, leather-bound ledger. I opened it. Page after page of immaculate, damning numbers, tracing millions of dollars in stolen, untaxed wealth. A slow, cold smile spread across my face in the darkness of the unit. I won't just burn it to the ground, Dad, I thought, tracing the forged signatures with my fingertip. I'm going to salt the earth. I didn't leave the storage unit immediately. I couldn't. I sat on the damp, oil-stained concrete floor for what felt like hours, the suffocating heat of the corrugated metal box pressing down on me, the single page of my father's letter resting on my knees. I needed the shock to subside. I needed the erratic, violent hammering of my heart to slow to a steady, operational rhythm. If I walked out of this facility in a blind panic, I would make a mistake. And making a mistake was a luxury I could no longer afford. When my pulse finally steadied, I moved with a clinical, detached efficiency. I walked back out to my dented Civic, popping the trunk and retrieving a large, heavy-duty canvas duffel bag I used for camping. I brought it back into the dim, sweltering unit and began the extraction. I handled the external hard drives as if they were unexploded ordnance, carefully wrapping each one in a spare hoodie before placing them at the bottom of the bag. The ledgers came next. There were 14 of them in total, each bound in thick, black leather, pages heavy with the weight of a decade of systematic, multi-million-dollar corporate treason. Stacked together, they were incredibly heavy. I hauled the bulging duffel bag over my shoulder, the thick canvas strap biting into my collarbone. Before leaving, I turned back to the commercial floor safe. I pushed the heavy steel door shut, engaging the massive deadbolts with a satisfying, final clack. I pulled the key free and pocketed it. Then, methodically, I rebuilt the wall of garbage. I dragged the rotting, floral mattress back over the safe, kicking the waterlogged cardboard boxes of useless 1990s tax returns into a chaotic pile on top of it. I covered it in a thick layer of dust and loose debris. When I was finished, it looked exactly as it had when I arrived, a worthless tomb of forgotten trash. I rolled the screeching metal door down, locked the heavily oxidized padlock, and drove away. The drive back to my apartment was an exercise in acute, suffocating paranoia. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror belonged to a private investigator hired by a leaner. Every unmarked van parked on the street was a surveillance team. It was an irrational response, born of the sudden, staggering realization of what was sitting in my trunk, but the fear was visceral. A leaner was a woman who commanded millions of dollars. If she even suspected I possessed the very evidence that could strip her of her freedom, she would crush me without a second thought. I didn't stop at red lights longer than necessary. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car was absolute, save for the hum of the tires and the faint, rhythmic shifting of the heavy canvas bag in the back. Once I was safely locked inside my fourth-floor walk-up, the deadbolt thrown and the chain secured, I drew the blinds. The apartment was sweltering, the ancient window AC unit rattling weakly, but I ignored it. I cleared off my small Formica kitchen table, set the duffel bag down, and unzipped it. I pulled out my personal laptop, a modest, mid-range machine I used for data analytics work, and severed its connection to the internet. No Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth, absolute air gap. I plugged the first solid-state drive into the USB port. A password prompt immediately flashed onto the screen. It was a high-tier encryption software, the kind utilized by defense contractors and paranoid executives. The decryption key is your mother's birthday, backwards. My mother was born on August 14, 1968. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I took a deep breath, steadying the slight tremor in my hands, and typed 86,914,180. I hit enter. For 3 agonizing seconds, the screen remained locked. Then, the progress bar flashed green, and the drive mounted to my desktop. I opened the root directory. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, categorized with the meticulous, obsessive-compulsive precision of a man who knew he was documenting his own murder by 1,000 cuts. There were dozens of master folders, each named for a different fiscal year, stretching back exactly 10 years. I double-clicked the folder labeled 2018, and then a subfolder named Offshore Disbursement and Shell Architectures. What I saw over the next 6 hours physically nauseated me. I had a degree in data analytics. I understood financial structures, profit margins, and corporate accounting. But this was not mere embezzlement. This was a sustained, incredibly sophisticated financial hemorrhage. Eleanor had not acted alone, but she was the undisputed architect. Over the years, she had established a network of phantom LLCs, shell companies with names like Apex Consulting Partners, Meridian Global Logistics, and Sunward Holdings Limited. These companies provided no actual services, produced no goods, and had no employees. Yet, according to the forged invoices and manipulated accounts payable records my father had captured, Vance Logistics was paying these entities hundreds of thousands of dollars a month for strategic consulting, overseas freight optimization, and specialized vendor acquisitions. But the real horror lay in the tax evasion. To hide the bleeding from the IRS, Aliner had masterminded a staggering scheme of corporate write-offs and depreciating assets that didn't exist. She was illegally deflating the company's taxable income by claiming massive, fabricated losses through these shell companies, effectively robbing the federal government of millions in corporate taxes while simultaneously siphoning that exact capital into private, nested trusts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. My father had captured everything. He had PDFs of the forged wire transfer authorizations, bearing his flawlessly copied signature. He had internal emails Aliner had sent from private, encrypted servers to offshore bankers, demanding the immediate transfer of funds. He had copies of the falsified K-1 tax forms submitted to the IRS. He had even managed to secure the actual account numbers and routing codes for her Cayman Island strongboxes. I closed the laptop and pulled one of the physical ledgers toward me. I flipped it open. The pages were filled with my father's cramped, urgent handwriting. He had cross-referenced every single digital file with handwritten notes. Date: October 12, 2021. Aliner forged authorization for $1.2 transfer to Meridian Global, disguised as Q4 operational losses on tax filings. Actual destination: Bank of Butterfield, Cayman Islands, account ending in 4409. I watched her smile at me across the dinner table tonight, wearing a new diamond tennis bracelet. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it all. Aliner had played the grieving widow, weeping into a monogrammed handkerchief at a cathedral, while sitting on a mountain of stolen, untaxed wealth. She had looked me in the eye and handed me a rusty key, believing she was untouchable. She wasn't just a gold digger. She was a federal criminal of the highest order. A profound, terrifying calm washed over me. The grief, the humiliation, the bitter resentment, it all evaporated, replaced by the cold, mechanical precision of an executioner. My father had given me the weapon. Now, I needed to figure out exactly where to aim it. I didn't want a civil lawsuit. If I took this to a probate lawyer to contest the will, it would trigger a years-long, grueling legal battle. Aliner had armies of lawyers on retainer. She would bury me in injunctions, claim the documents were forged, and tie the estate up in litigation until I was bankrupt and broken. Furthermore, a civil suit would only get me a piece of the estate. It wouldn't put her in a cage. It wouldn't destroy her. No, this wasn't a family dispute. This was a federal crime. Over the next 3 days, I didn't go to work. I called in sick, barricaded in my apartment, consuming every piece of information I could find on white-collar crime, federal jurisdiction, and financial fraud. I considered the FBI, but corporate embezzlement cases could languish on agents' desks for years without action. I considered the SEC, but Vance Logistics was a private company, not publicly traded, muddying their jurisdiction. Then, at 2 in the morning on a Thursday, staring at a legal forum with burning, bloodshot eyes, I found it. The IRS whistleblower office. I read the statutes with mounting, incredulous shock. The United States Internal Revenue Service does not play games with high net worth tax evasion. Under Section 7623B of the Internal Revenue Code, if an individual provides actionable, concrete evidence of massive tax fraud exceeding $2 million, the IRS will not only launch a devastating criminal investigation, but they are legally mandated to pay the whistleblower an award of 15% to 30% of the total proceeds collected. I looked at the ledgers. Based on my preliminary calculations, Aliner had shielded over $40 million in corporate income from federal taxation over the last decade, incurring massive penalties and interest. If the IRS recovered those funds, the whistleblower reward wouldn't just be a comfortable payout. It would be an 8-figure sum. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating the dark room. "Oh, Dad," I whispered into the silence. You absolute magnificent bastard. He hadn't just given me the tools for revenge. He had found a way to leave me a massive, untainted inheritance, completely circumventing the will, the estate lawyers, and Alina's control. By making me the sole possessor of the evidence, he had made me the sole legal claimant to the federal whistleblower reward. It was brilliant. It was flawless. I downloaded IRS Form 211. Application for award for original information. I spent the next 48 hours filling it out with the meticulous precision of a bomb technician. I didn't just provide a summary, I created a comprehensive, indexed dossier. I drafted a 50-page executive summary detailing the exact mechanisms of the fraud, complete with cross-references to the offshore account numbers, the forged documents, and the falsified corporate tax returns. I copied the hard drives onto encrypted, sterile flash drives. I packaged it all into a single, heavily sealed, tamper-proof courier box, but before I could mail it, the universe decided to test my resolve. On Monday morning, I was forced to leave my apartment. My father had maintained a very small, personal checking account at a boutique private bank downtown, an account containing roughly $3,000 that he used for trivial, untraceable cash expenses. As his biological daughter, the bank required my physical signature to officially release the microscopic funds to the estate and close the account, a final bit of administrative housekeeping mandated by Sterling and Vance. I dressed in my usual, unassuming work clothes, slacks and a plain blouse, and took the subway downtown. The bank was an opulent cathedral of finance, all marble columns, hushed voices, and velvet ropes. I was sitting in a plush leather waiting chair, reviewing the closure documents on a clipboard, when the heavy glass doors of the bank swung open. A loud, braying laugh shattered the dignified quiet of the lobby. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. Trent and Chase walked in, moving with the obnoxious, entitled swagger of men who believed they owned the building. Trent was wearing designer sunglasses indoors, a heavily branded track jacket, and a massive gold chain. Chase was in another tailored suit, talking loudly on his phone about a seed round for a disruptive tech startup. They were accompanied by a senior branch manager, who was practically bowing as he escorted them toward the VIP transaction rooms. They were here to finalize the setup of their new multi-million-dollar trust accounts. I lowered my head, staring intently at the clipboard, praying they would walk past. They didn't. Trent stopped dead in his tracks, pulling his sunglasses down the bridge of his nose. He nudged Chase, who abruptly ended his phone call. They pivoted in unison and sauntered over to where I was sitting. "Well, well, well," Trent crowed, his voice carrying across the quiet lobby, drawing the annoyed glances of several tellers. "Look who it is. The prodigal daughter, slumming it in the financial district." I kept my eyes on the paperwork. "Hello, Trent, Chase. I'm just here to sign some closure forms." Right, Chase smirked, leaning against a marble pillar, looking me up and down with blatant pity. "The estate lawyers mentioned you had to come down here to release the old man's coffee fund. $3,000, right? Must be tough, watching those pennies evaporate." "It's administrative," I said softly, employing every ounce of willpower to keep my voice flat and defeated. I needed them to believe I was broken. I needed them to feel like absolute victors. The trap only works if the prey doesn't see the teeth. "Hey, how was the storage unit?" Trent asked, unable to resist twisting the knife. He pulled out a thick, platinum money clip overflowing with $100 bills and began casually flipping through it. "Did you find any buried treasure? A vintage collection of mothballs, maybe. Mom said you practically ran out of the lawyer's office to go claim your garbage." I looked up at him. I let my shoulders slump, perfectly mimicking the posture of a beaten, humiliated woman. I forced my eyes to glass over slightly. "It was just old files," I lied, my voice wavering perfectly. "Just trash. The facility is going to throw it all away by Friday." Chase laughed, a sharp barking sound. "God, that's pathetic. The old man really didn't give a single shit about you in the end, did he? Left you with literal garbage while we're stepping up to run the empire." "He was complicated," I whispered, playing the victim. Trent stepped closer, looking down at me. The smugness radiating off him was palpable, a toxic aura of unearned triumph. He peeled a crisp, new $100 bill off his stack. With an exaggerated sigh of mock pity, he held it out, letting it flutter down to rest on my clipboard. "Here," Trent said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Buy yourself a decent lunch, Claire, on us. Consider it a charitable donation from the Vance estate. We're in a generous mood today." I stared at the $100 bill resting on my father's closure forms. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was almost poetic. They were handing me $100 of stolen money to mock my poverty, entirely unaware that the canvas duffel bag currently sitting on my kitchen table was going to reduce them to absolute, humiliating ruin. Slowly, deliberately, I picked up the $100 bill. I folded it neatly and slipped it into my pocket. I looked up at Trent and Chase and gave them exactly what they wanted, a weak, subservient nod. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You guys got exactly what you deserved. Enjoy it." "Oh, we will," Chase grinned, turning away. "See you around, Claire." Or, probably not. They strutted away, following the groveling branch manager into the VIP suites, entirely oblivious to the executioner's axe I had just finished sharpening. I watched the heavy oak doors close behind them. The subservience vanished from my posture instantly. My spine straightened. I signed the closure form with a vicious, slashing signature, handed the clipboard to a terrified-looking teller, and walked out of the bank. I didn't mail the package. The stakes were too high to trust the postal service. The next morning, I rented a car, a nondescript gray sedan, and drove 4 hours to the nearest major regional office of the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division, SID. I wasn't going to a standard local branch where tax audits were handled. I was going to the federal law enforcement arm, the elite, gun-carrying special agents who took down cartels and massive corporate fraudsters. The federal building was an imposing, brutalist structure of concrete and tinted glass. I walked through the heavy revolving doors, carrying only a thick leather briefcase containing the dossier, the flash drives, and 2 of the physical ledgers. The security was intense. I passed through metal detectors, my briefcase was X-rayed, and I was directed to a sterile, bulletproof glass reception window. "I need to speak with a duty agent for the Criminal Investigation Division," I told the severe-looking woman behind the glass. "I am submitting an original Form 211 whistleblower claim regarding multi-million-dollar corporate tax fraud and offshore embezzlement." The woman paused, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. She looked at me, taking in my calm demeanor and the heavy briefcase. She didn't ask for details. She simply picked up a heavy black telephone. 10 minutes later, I was escorted by an armed security guard into the bowels of the building. The hallways were aggressively devoid of color, white walls, gray carpets, buzzing fluorescent lights. We arrived at a heavy steel door marked Interview Room 4. The room was Spartan. A metal table, 3 uncomfortable chairs, and a black-domed camera mounted in the corner. I sat down, placing my briefcase on the table, and waited. 5 minutes later, the door opened. 2 agents walked in. They didn't look like accountants. They looked like detectives. The lead agent was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with a military haircut and a sharply tailored, albeit cheap, suit. He introduced himself as Special Agent Miller. His partner, Special Agent Davis, was a younger woman with a piercing, analytical gaze and a notepad. They sat down across from me. Miller didn't smile. "Miss Vance," Miller started, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The desk said you're here to file a 211. I'll be honest with you, 90% of the walk-ins we get are disgruntled ex-spouses making wild accusations over 50 grand in hidden income. We are federal law enforcement. Our threshold for opening a case is extremely high. Do you understand?" "I understand perfectly, Agent Miller," I replied evenly. I didn't blink, I didn't waver. I clicked the latches on my briefcase. They echoed loudly in the small room. I opened it and pulled out the 50-page, perfectly bound executive summary. I slid it across the metal table. "My father was Richard Vance, CEO and majority shareholder of Vance Logistics," I said, my voice steady and cold. "He passed away last week. Upon his death, I came into possession of his private, encrypted files. What you are looking at is the executive summary of a 10-year, systematic corporate tax evasion and embezzlement ring orchestrated by his wife, Eleanor Vance." Miller looked at the cover page, his expression neutral. Davis tapped her pen against her notepad. "People make accusations all the time, Miss Vance," Davis said smoothly. "Do you have proof? Emails, bank statements?" I reached into the briefcase and pulled out the two physical, leather-bound ledgers. I set them on the table with a heavy thud. Next to them, I placed the sterile, encrypted flash drives. "I have everything," I said, leaning forward slightly, holding their gaze. "I have the forged K-1s. I have the fabricated accounts payable records to a network of phantom LLCs. I have the decrypted internal emails from a leaner to offshore bankers. And, most importantly, I have the routing numbers, the account numbers, and the SWIFT codes for 6 nested shell accounts at the Bank of Butterfield in the Cayman Islands, where she has illegally sheltered over $40 million in corporate assets from the United States government." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The mild, bureaucratic annoyance vanished from Miller's face, replaced by the razor-sharp, predatory focus of a hound catching a scent. He looked at the heavy leather ledgers, then at the flash drives, and finally, back up at me. "You have the offshore routing numbers?" Miller asked, his voice dropping an octave, the skepticism completely gone. "I have the offshore routing numbers, the forged wire authorizations, and the corresponding deflated tax returns submitted to your agency for the last 10 consecutive fiscal years," I confirmed. "It is a closed loop, the paper trail is pristine. It is, by all definitions, a golden platter." Miller slowly reached out and opened the first ledger. He flipped to a random page. His eyes scanned the cramped, immaculate handwriting, tracking the documented millions siphoning from a domestic logistics firm into the Caribbean ether. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of the agent turning the pages. Agent Davis leaned in, looking over his shoulder. I saw her eyes widen slightly as she registered the dollar amounts. After 3 agonizingly long minutes, Miller closed the ledger. He placed his hands flat on the metal table. He looked at me, and for the first time, a small, terrifyingly grim smile played at the corners of his mouth. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed the career-making bust of a lifetime. "Miss Vance," Miller said softly, "I'm going to need you to officially sign this Form 211 under penalty of perjury. Then, we are going to take these drives to our forensic tech department." "I brought a pen," I replied, pulling it from my pocket. "Good." Miller leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. The demeanor of a skeptical bureaucrat was gone. He was now speaking to me as a crucial operational asset. "I need to make something absolutely clear to you right now. If what is on these drives matches what you claim, this is no longer a family matter. This is a massive federal criminal investigation. Eleanor Vance is not going to get a slap on the wrist or an audit. She is going to face heavily armed federal agents, asset forfeiture, and a very long sentence in federal prison." "That," I said without a trace of emotion, "is exactly what I am counting on." "Then here is your directive," Miller leaned forward, his voice hard and uncompromising. "You go home, you do not speak to Eleanor, you do not speak to your stepbrothers, you do not log into any shared accounts, and you do not ask questions. You act like the grieving, defeated daughter they think you are. You maintain absolute, total radio silence." "How long?" I asked. "Federal warrants of this magnitude, especially involving offshore subpoenas and coordinating a raid on a major estate, take time. We have to follow the money, freeze the accounts before she can move them, and build an inescapable cage," Miller said, tapping the ledger. "It might take weeks, it might take months, but you let us do our jobs, do not spook the target. Do you understand?" I nodded slowly, a profound sense of peace settling over my bones. The trap was set. The federal machine had been awakened, and its crosshairs were painted directly on the Vance estate. "I understand, Agent Miller." I won't say a word. I signed the Form 211, relinquishing the evidence to the United States government. I walked out of the sterile federal building and into the glaring afternoon sun. I got into my rental car and began the long drive back to my city. I had done it. The malicious compliance was complete. They had told me to take my garbage and leave them alone. And I had done exactly that. Now, all there was left to do was wait for the explosion. The hardest part of laying a trap is the silence that follows. For 3 agonizing months, I lived in a state of suspended animation. I went to my logistics job, I drank cheap coffee in the break room, I paid my exorbitant rent, and I existed as a ghost in my own life. I had handed a nuclear warhead to the federal government, but the wheels of federal justice grind with terrifying, invisible slowness. Agent Miller had warned me that building an inescapable cage took time, but the waiting was a psychological torture all its own. To survive the silence, I had to watch them celebrate. I created a burner account on Instagram specifically to monitor Trent and Chase. It was a digital window into a grotesque, unfolding tragedy of unearned wealth. Within weeks of my father's death, the mourning period was entirely discarded. Trent's feed transformed into a relentless barrage of hyperconsumerism. He bought a custom-wrapped, matte purple Lamborghini to park next to the G-Wagon my father had left him. He posted videos of himself spraying $1,000 bottles of champagne off the backs of rented yachts in Miami, captioning them with nauseating quotes about hustle and building an empire. Chase, ever the visionary, had taken his $5 million trust fund and immediately sunk it into a sprawling, hilariously mismanaged tech startup that promised to revolutionize the blockchain logistics space. A company that, from what I could gather from his furious, chaotic LinkedIn posts, consisted entirely of a rented penthouse office, a ping-pong table, and absolutely no proprietary software. And Alina was the reigning queen of the city's high society. She was featured in a prominent local lifestyle magazine in a sprawling, 6-page spread titled Grace Under Fire, How Alina Vance is Steering the Vance Legacy. The photos showed her lounging in the sunroom of my childhood home, dripping in diamonds, looking sorrowful yet incredibly Botoxed. She gave quotes about her profound grief and her commitment to philanthropy. Every post, every photo, every arrogant smirk was a serrated blade twisting in my ribs. There were nights I sat on my thrift store sofa, the glow of my phone illuminating my face, gripping the cushions so hard my knuckles bruised, wondering if I had made a catastrophic mistake. Maybe the IRS wouldn't act, maybe Alina's lawyers were too good, maybe the rich truly were untouchable. But then, the leaves began to turn brown, the sweltering summer gave way to a crisp autumn, and Alina made her fatal, arrogant mistake. She announced the Richard Vance Memorial Gala. It was billed as a night of remembrance and high-end charity, but everyone in the city knew exactly what it was: a coronation. Alina was officially stepping out from the shadow of her dead husband to claim her throne. The gala was to be held at the main estate, my childhood home, on a Saturday night in late October. The guest list was exclusively top-tier. State senators, hedge fund managers, and celebrity influencers invited by Trent. Social media was flooded with behind-the-scenes preparations for weeks. They were constructing massive, heated glass tents on the manicured lawns. They were flying in white truffles from Alba and a Michelin-starred catering team from New York. I was, naturally, not invited, but I wasn't going to miss it. On the night of the gala, the air was bitterly cold. I drove my dented Civic up the winding canyon roads, the exact same route I had taken the night my father died. But this time, I didn't stop at the imposing wrought iron gates. I bypassed the main entrance, driving half a mile further up the canyon to a narrow, unpaved scenic overlook that peered directly down onto the sprawling Vance estate. I parked in the darkness, turned off my headlights, and stepped out into the freezing wind. I zipped my heavy coat up to my chin and looked down at the kingdom that had expelled me. It was a spectacle of obscene wealth. The estate was illuminated by massive, sweeping spotlights that cut through the dark autumn sky. A fleet of luxury vehicles, Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, Ferraris, snaked up the long driveway, handing their keys to an army of tuxedoed valets. The glass tents glowed from within, radiating warm, golden light and the faint, thumping bass of a live orchestra. Through my binoculars, I could see the silhouette of the party. Hundreds of people in black tie attire, laughing, drinking, oblivious to the fact that they were standing on a crime scene. I sat on the hood of my car, my phone in my hand. I opened Trent's Instagram. He was live streaming. I tapped the screen, and Trent's flushed, grinning face filled my display. He was wearing a stark white tuxedo jacket, holding a crystal flute of champagne, shouting over the loud, surging music. "What is up, everyone? "We are live from the Vance Memorial Gala," he yelled, panning the camera to show the massive ice sculptures and the crowded dance floor. "The energy tonight is absolutely insane. Shout out to my beautiful mother for putting this together. We're keeping the legacy alive, baby. Look at this, look at this." He spun the camera, capturing Chase, who was aggressively hitting on a bored-looking model, and then he found a leaner. She was holding court near the grand staircase, wearing a breathtaking, sweeping gown of midnight blue silk. She looked like a monarch, radiating absolute, untouchable power. She saw Trent filming, offered a regal, practiced smile to the camera, and raised her glass in a toast. I lowered my phone, looking from the small screen down to the glowing estate in the valley below. I checked my watch. 9:45. If Agent Miller had kept his word, the hammer was about to fall. I held my breath, the freezing wind whipping my hair across my face, my eyes locked on the long, winding road leading up the canyon. At 9:48, the darkness at the bottom of the canyon road was shattered. It didn't start with sirens. It started with headlights. A massive, synchronized convoy of identical, matte black SUVs tore up the canyon road, moving with a terrifying, unified speed. There were at least 15 of them, flanked by heavily armored tactical transport vans. They didn't slow down as they approached the queue of luxury cars waiting for the valet. Suddenly, the night erupted in blinding, strobing blue and red lights. The sirens wailed, a deafening, mechanical shriek that echoed off the canyon walls and drowned out the orchestra. Down in the valley, I watched through my binoculars as the lead SUVs violently breached the perimeter. They didn't stop at the keypad. They rammed the massive wrought iron gates, the heavy metal swinging inward with a violent, sparking crash. Chaos. Absolute, instantaneous chaos. The valet scattered into the manicured bushes. The convoy swarmed the circular driveway, tires screeching on the cobblestones. Dozens of figures clad in heavy, dark tactical gear and windbreakers bearing the massive yellow letters RSCID poured out of the vehicles before they even fully stopped. They were armed. They were moving with the aggressive, overwhelming force of a military strike. I looked down at my phone. Trent's live stream was still running, but the angle was wild and frantic. The music had abruptly cut out. "What the hell is going on?" Trent's voice screamed from my phone's speaker, the arrogance entirely evaporated, replaced by raw, trembling panic. "Hey, you can't come in here. This is private property. Who the fuck are you?" The camera jerked violently. I saw a flash of a federal agent in a tactical vest shoving past a terrified waiter. Then, a booming, amplified voice echoed both from my phone and from the valley below, carrying over the cold night air. "Federal AGENTS. We have WARRANTS for the arrest of ELEANORVANCE and the seizure of this property. Everyone remain where you are and keep your hands visible." Trent's live stream captured the exact moment his world ended. The camera swung wildly and caught a leaner. She was no longer a queen holding court. She was backed against the grand marble staircase, her midnight blue silk gown looking absurdly fragile against the heavy ballistic vests of the 3 federal agents surrounding her. "Get your hands off me," a leaner shrieked, a horrific, ugly sound that stripped away a decade of manufactured elegance. "Do you know who I am? I will have your badges. I will sue the federal government. Eleanor Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive corporate tax evasion, and money laundering." Agent Miller's voice, the same low, gravelly rumble I had heard in the interrogation room, cut through her hysteria. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." She fought them. It was a pathetic, thrashing struggle that resulted in 2 agents forcibly spinning her around, slamming her face first into the cold marble pillar of the staircase. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent, horrified crowd. "Mom!" Trent screamed on the stream. He lunged forward. The camera tumbled, capturing a blur of motion before Trent was violently tackled to the floor by an agent. The phone skittered across the polished marble, coming to rest facing the ceiling. I could hear Chase weeping. Actual, sobbing wails of terror. "I don't know anything. I just got the trust fund. I didn't do it." The live stream abruptly cut to black as someone crushed the phone under a tactical boot. I slowly lowered my device. Down in the valley, the blue and red lights painted the glass tents in a frantic, demonic strobe. I watched as Eleanor Vance, the woman who had systematically erased my mother, manipulated my father, and cast me out into the world with $1 and a rusty key, was frog-marched out of the front doors of my childhood home. Her head was bowed, her designer gown ruined, illuminated by the flashes of cell phone cameras from her own high society guests. They stuffed her into the back of a black SUV like common refuse. A heavy, industrial flatbed tow truck rumbled up the driveway. I watched with profound, freezing satisfaction as they hooked up Trent's purple Lamborghini and Chase's G-Wagon, hauling them away as seized criminal assets. The toxic normal was dead. I had burned the kingdom to the ashes. I sat on the hood of my car for another hour, watching the federal agents dismantle the gala, turning the opulent estate into a sprawling crime scene. The freezing wind didn't bother me anymore. I felt lighter than I had in 12 years. I slid off the hood, got into my dented Civic, turned the heater on blast, and drove home. The fallout over the next week was apocalyptic. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division does not merely arrest you. They execute a total financial decapitation. Because my father's meticulous ledgers proved that the entirety of Aliner's empire was built on, and commingled with, stolen federal tax dollars, the government enacted immediate, devastating asset forfeiture. Every single bank account bearing Aliner's name was frozen. The Cayman Island accounts were seized through international legal treaties I had helped expedite. The main estate in the canyon, the ski lodge in Aspen, the villa in Maui, all locked, boarded up, and seized by the U.S. Marshals pending auction. But the most beautiful destruction fell upon Trent and Chase. The trust funds my father had left them, funded by the liquidated assets of Vance Logistics, which the IRS immediately audited and flagged as the primary vehicle for the fraud. The trusts were dissolved overnight. Their black cards were declined. The luxury condo Chase was renting for his startup evicted him when the wire transfer bounced. 4 days after the raid, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered it, placing it on speaker and resting it on my cheap Formica kitchen table. "Hello," I said. "Claire, oh my God, Claire, please." It was Trent. His voice was ragged, desperate, and devoid of the smug, braying arrogance he had weaponized his entire life. In the background, I could hear the roar of highway traffic. "Claire, they took everything. They literally took the clothes out of my closet. The feds won't even let us talk to Mom. Chase and we're at a Motel 6. We don't have anything to eat. The cards are all declining." "That sounds difficult, Trent," I said, my voice as calm and flat as a frozen lake. "Please," he begged, a pathetic sob catching in his throat. We know we were hard on you, but we're family. We need help. Just a few $1,000s to get a lawyer or to get a better hotel. Just until we sort this out. We know you have a job. You have savings." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the blank wall of my apartment. I thought about the $100 bill he had thrown at me in the bank lobby. I thought about the rusted key. I thought about my father, dying alone in his office while these parasites sucked him dry. "Trent," I said softly, enunciating every syllable with lethal precision. "Do you remember when you and Chase handed me $100 and told me to buy a decent lunch? Do you remember telling me that I got exactly what I deserved?" Silence on the line, a heavy, suffocating silence. "Yes," he finally whispered. "I have $100, I told him. I'll mail it to the Motel 6. Consider it a charitable donation from the Vance estate. Now lose my number and never attempt to contact me again." I hung up, I blocked the number. I blocked all unknown callers. I poured myself a glass of cheap tap water, drank it, and slept for 14 hours straight, the deepest, most restful sleep of my entire life. The justice system is a slow, grinding beast, but when the evidence is insurmountable, it feasts quickly. Aliner's high-priced defense attorneys abandoned her the moment her assets were frozen, and they realized they weren't going to get paid. She was assigned a public defender. Faced with the staggering mountain of pristine, irrefutable evidence I had handed the IRS, the forged signatures, the internal emails, the Cayman routing numbers, the federal prosecutors didn't even offer a lenient plea deal. They didn't have to. Aliner Vance, terrified of dying in a concrete box, pleaded guilty to 32 counts of federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering. 2 years after the night of the gala, she stood in a federal courtroom, wearing a shapeless orange jumpsuit, stripped of her makeup, her Botox fading, her hair graying at the roots. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole, citing the breathtaking scope and cynical malice of her crimes. Trent and Chase, entirely incapable of surviving in the real world without a stolen fortune to prop them up, spiraled into immediate obscurity. Last I heard through the grapevine of old acquaintances, Chase was working as a shift manager at a regional tire shop, drowning in debt from his failed startup. Trent's influencer career died the moment he couldn't afford to rent the lifestyle he projected. He was living in a studio apartment with 3 roommates, occasionally posting grainy photos of his glory days to an audience that no longer cared. As for me, the IRS whistleblower office is a bureaucratic labyrinth, but federal law is absolute. Under Section 7623B, the government successfully recovered $43 million in stolen assets, unpaid corporate taxes, and punitive penalties from a leaner's offshore accounts and the liquidation of the seized estates. Because my information was original, comprehensive, and directly led to the recovery of the funds, my claim was approved at the maximum statutory rate of 15%. 3 weeks after a leaner's sentencing, I walked down the 4 flights of stairs in my drafty apartment building to check the mail. Tucked between a grocery flyer and a utility bill was a heavy, stark white envelope bearing the seal of the United States Department of the Treasury. I walked back up to my apartment, my hands shaking slightly. I sat at the same Formica table where I had decrypted the drives. I opened the envelope. Inside was a formal letter of gratitude from the Internal Revenue Service and a direct deposit confirmation slip. Amount transferred, $6,450,000 and 0 cents. $6.45 million. Clean, legal, taxed, untouchable by any civil suit, entirely separated from my father's cursed will, and completely unknown to the stepbrothers who thought they had left me with nothing. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. I didn't cheer. I didn't pop champagne. I simply laid my head down on the cheap table and let out a long, shuddering breath that carried 12 years of marginalized pain, anger, and grief out of my body. It was over. I had won. A month later, I moved out of the apartment. I didn't buy a Lamborghini, and I didn't rent a yacht. I bought a beautiful, quiet, mid-century modern home nestled deep in the redwood forests, hours away from the toxic, glittering city of my childhood. I invested the rest in quiet, low-yield index funds. I kept my job in logistics, moving to a remote consulting position, simply because I liked the routine. My new house has massive, floor-to-ceiling windows that look out into the ancient, silent trees. It is a place of absolute peace. There is no screaming, no manufactured drama, no suffocating perfume. In the center of my new living room, hanging on the clean white wall above the fireplace, is a small, custom-built shadow box. Inside the glass rests a single, heavily oxidized, rusted brass key. Whenever the silence of the forest feels too heavy, or whenever I wonder if my father truly loved me in the end, I look at that key. I remember the smug, victorious smile on Alina's face when she handed it to me. I remember Trent telling me I got exactly what I deserved, and I smile.